Tina koto katoa. I'd like to thank the New Zealand Institute of Architects for the honour of inviting me to share my stories in the 2022 Ian Athfield Memorial Lecture. My thanks to the sponsors Rosine and the many friendships over many years from my Kiwi counterparts. I've enjoyed so many visits here over so many years. In 2020, upon receiving the gold medal from the AIA, I had cause to reflect on my many years of practice. I've blended the stories of those talks that were distributed throughout a series of, on a broken cycle of lectures all around Australia during COVID. You can imagine how difficult that was. I've now come back into the talk, reappraised it, added stories, particularly ones that I think are more reflective of some of the expansive life of ideas of Ath. I hope you would approve. At the time of my reflection, it was a time of absolute isolation. You've heard about that, our time in Melbourne in lockdown. It's remarkable as I thought about this lecture, as the foundation of my practice has been something I've always done with others. We're currently a practice of many, with many studios, in two studios, not many studios, two studios in Melbourne and Sydney, and outposts in Brisbane and Launceston. We're led by 5 principals and 5 partners and 7 principals. There is much to unpick as I delve into the chronology of practice. The buildings themselves are evidence of the extraordinary collective endeavour of many of our staff. The drawn line is a fascination and gives great insight into practice. Nothing throughout history of architecture has recorded authorship more than the conceptual drawing, the genius idea. Yet the drawings of our many projects frequently suggest layers of authorship by many participants. As I review them, I recall many of the conversations that they were a part of. They are often uncertain and explanatory and almost always incomplete. The ones I have generated solely frequently require the participation of others to resolve. Now, with digital technologies enabling so much of what we do, there is an unevenness of recording both the conceptual sketch and the conversation that accompanied it. However, the digital whiteboard does record in the form of a digital diary the inputs of many participants and perhaps more accurately charts the course of a project's inception and development. I'd like to draw you to the stories of practice to expose at least some of the reasons why. In doing so, I can avoid any semblance of a manifesto. I'll speak of collecting, of people, objects and experiences. This underlying curiosity frequently draws me to most appreciate the work of others that is unlike my own. For my part, it's been over 30 years of running hard, always forward but frequently deviating to navigate new territory. As a first-generation practice, addressing new experience has been a constant. Too often I've been too concerned with the running to give much thought to the direction. In writing this talk, I'm aware there's a sense of navigation that looking backwards can sometimes provide. Australia and New Zealand had something of a shared experience during the various lockdowns through much of 2020 and 21. My time was shaped by seeing the world through 2 dramatically different lenses, both shifting in their focus. From the domestic setting of my home, the realities of isolation and confinement were felt profoundly. Yet by contrast, it was also a year of extraordinary connection. Amid the play of proximity and distance, people became data, numbers, percentages, averages, and yet also highly personalised. Faces on screens set against living rooms, bookcases, and much evidence of personal and family life. And at times unsatisfying merging of intimacy and physical detachment. Throughout history, we can refer to the evidence of the work of architects recording moments of change, many in response to traumatic occurrences. These have at times been moments of great invention, of creative practice shifting radically on platforms of new technologies and, importantly, new codes of cultural practice, in concert with society embracing change with an understanding of its necessity. A natural push-pull tension to our current situation undoubtedly exists to get economies up and running again. Conversely, there's a genuine desire from many to pause and reflect on the way we design cities, homes and workspaces, and do it more intelligently, more sustainably, To lose ground on the urgency to kickstarting our economies will demean the deeper lessons of COVID-19. Being able to adapt and survive, to prosper and benefit from change will be a measure for our success. The constantly shifting tempo of our liaison with others has always been at the foundation of our architectural practice. We are currently through a series of workshops inviting many within the practice to consider major changes to the way we operate under the themes culture, technology and service. We see this as a time in our history to undertake substantial change. The measures for the success of what we do now are far more complex and the circumstances that inform them constantly changing. We appreciate the advantages of new methods of timber construction and prefabricated assembly as we sequester carbon harvested from trees, but remain uncertain about the processes of removing them from their forests. We must add density to our existing suburbs, but as we do, we're aware of the substantial loss of the suburban landscape. We appreciate that technology in its many forms is causal in so much of what we now contend with, but likely to be redemptive in the many solutions we seek. We are rarely empowered to directly change political will or the metrics of large development corporations, but we can manoeuvre into place powerful examples of built work that can shape community values to effect change. So much of what we do is responsive to the immediacy of the present, while being attuned to the need to be purposeful, responsible, and build well, as if for eternity. At times, I'd have to admit to driving more than a skerrick of anxiety into our processes in our endeavour to accord with this. And here lies a conundrum. Our fleet of 4 buildings for the University of Tasmania, and most particularly the latest 2, designed entirely during lockdown, have deeply considered finite resources and sought to understand and optimise the environmental costs of structure and fabric. We've worked closely with industry more than ever before to appraise the origins, utilisation, assembly and inevitable dismantling to evaluate total carbon utilisation through a circular economy. We've developed an architecture of expressive assembly and in doing so contemplated one day its complete disassembly. Now the first of these buildings, the library, is complete. I do hope that its dismantling is some way off. I should also acknowledge a key design contributor, a young Kiwi, Nick Roberts, who's now left us to return home and has established his own practice in Auckland. As a 12-year-old growing up in Geelong, I bred bantams. I'd take a journey from our house to the edge of the Barwon River along its winding course to an old farm where a family, amongst other things, bred bantams. I would swap my pocket money for 1 or 2 chicks and tuck them inside my shirt and start the hour-long journey home over weirs up rocky inclines along the bank of that beautiful river. One day I arrived to find the farm empty of livestock and the house being demolished by men in 2 large excavators. As I arrived, the roofing and wall lining had been removed to reveal the skeleton framing of many rooms of this ancient structure. Revealed in the centre of it all and perfectly intact was the original single-room slab hut with a split shingle roof. I ran between the 2 excavators and their cursing operators and collected a series of remnants. They still remain the owner of those to this day. This was the first of what would be a series of barely legal archaeological digs and the start of a life of collecting. But more important than the artefacts collected was the powerful realisation of that single moment when all is lost to the irreversibility of the process of demolition. Mine is a vast and undisciplined collection that is the result of archaeological digs in many places, the builders' yards at Hadrian's Villa and Villa d'Este, beside roadworks at the pyramids of Giza, ploughed fields of Agrigento and the restoration works of the Duomo's terracotta roof in Florence. Walks through empty villages in rural Japan and the Thames at low tide during every visit to London. Also the junk and antique markets in just about every place my wife Susan and I have ever visited. Our design process is often driven by a curiosity for objects and places and the way in which disparate objects can be linked by coincidence. These coincidences evoke an interest in the commonality between seemingly unrelated things, as their histories are both specific to place but also have parallels elsewhere that we can draw upon. The objects assembled in my own living room are interesting, not so much for any particular aesthetic value, but more the representation of the people, moments within time, various technologies and cultural practices they exhibit. We appreciate the influence of local craft on a society that has grown around its traditions, but at the same time we're fascinated by different societies and their history of making. We often look for ways to incorporate different making processes with our own. In 2007, upon the completion of the Nigel Peck Centre at Melbourne Grammar School, and well after withdrawing their objection to our design, the National Trust asked me to speak at their annual conference. It's only recently I've been able to admit this to the remainder of our profession in Melbourne. I presented a simple thesis that with so much of the important heritage fabric lost in our cities, that we should place a higher value on all that remains, but be able to find ways to build contemporary fabric more appropriately in close proximity. I then presented a diagram of a bell curve. It registered a sad truth: the span of an architect's career and life that encompasses gaining experience, establishing practice, the fertile years, and finally retirement has a parallel. An unfortunate occurrence is represented in this curve, as the remainder of the life of an architect coincides with the degrading of building fabric and shifts in requirements and original purpose. This means that so often architects live to see their best work being demolished or substantially altered by the next generation. My reason for illustrating this was not so much the personal sensitivities of people in our profession, but the need for earlier recognition of the value of the best of what we do. Melbourne Grammar have just invited us back in a competition which we've won, thankfully, at a time we really wanted to win a competition recently for another building adjacent to our Nigel Peck Centre. So hopefully it'll do something to establish probably the importance of both buildings and stand as testament to the school's ambitions and our work over many years ahead. Ath was as staunchly individual as his buildings. His legacy was as an architect, iconoclast, educator and collaborator, and he used his public voice to bring greater visibility to the profession and influence attitudes to the built environment. Seen clearly in the lineage of his built work is this vast evidence of his great processes and great advocacy on behalf of our profession. I'd like to share with you a mapping of some of our cultural moments within our practice life. In 2016, for our exhibition Coincidences, we invited 13 photographers to take a single photograph of two of our buildings and find their own story of translation between the two. Almost all were unexpected, and their stories were added to our own. 2017 was a year of flux and disruption. Trump had just come to the White House proposing a wall between America and Mexico. Syrians were marching across Europe trying to find a safe haven, and our borders remained closed to many while our leaders debated immigration policy in Australia. When preparing to launch our book, This Building Likes Me, to celebrate our 30th anniversary, I sent a questionnaire around asking all of our staff where they were born, what university they attended, and where their parents were born. This search for the DNA of our practice was born. As part of a very involved Christmas present that year, we paid for all of our staff to have a DNA test. This generated a lot of interest and prompted many members of the team to delve into their diverse ancestry and share it over many lunches and Friday night talks. From this came a larger story, and the theme of hybridity became a central focus of our year. There may well be a link to the origins of my gathering of both objects and people that has set in train a type of practice that celebrates the variance of collective endeavour. And so the upside down at the bottom of the world bowl was designed with assistance from friend and collaborator Simon Lloyd to celebrate this. D.H. Lawrence's note, upside down at the bottom of the world, written forlornly at the end of each of his letters home while in Australia writing kangaroo in the 1920s, became our appreciation of our position in the world, upside down, adhered to the base of this vast sphere by gravity. My bowl was dutifully accepted by our staff the next Christmas, who then went about finding uses that ranged far beyond my conception. 3 of the many that could be shown to a larger audience. This research into collective memory also registers our interest beyond the people and places evident in artefacts to the landscape itself. The myth that prior to European settlement, Australia was an untamed wilderness has been dispelled in many books and by a whole new generation of academics. The complex and sophisticated systems of land management used by Indigenous Australians have been revealed through gathering many threads of memory and early reporting to make more complex our appreciation of the natural landscape. This knowledge is instructive as we reframe contemporary land practice to combat the results of global warming and land degeneration. In Australia, engagement with our First Nations communities is a complex, rich and absolutely necessary endeavour that has infused new layers of collaboration to almost all of the public commissions we undertake, as we learn from languages that better describe the Australian landscape and custodianship of place. This is a necessary rush to make up for time lost. Encouraged by our engagement during 2020 with the Djadjarawang elders throughout the design phases of our Bendigo law courts, we're instigating now a series of initiatives to create a better framework for these engaging conversations. Our proposal for the National Centre for Australian Children's Literature on the shores of our capital's Lake Burley-Griffin has at its centre the Garden of the Spoken Word, a place for such continuing storytelling. In perfect counterpoint to the intense demands of practice and the urban settings that we work within, Waterview, our family farm on Bruni Island, has become our important other place. Bruni is overtly beautiful, with evidence of its past always ready to surface in the forms of, at times, difficult conversations. The second Utsun Symposium was held there in 2014, and Yohani Palasma led a small group of us to tutor young architects from many other places in our shearers' quarters and our neighbour's shearing shed for a week, while simultaneously a team of veterinarians artificially inseminated their sheep over the course of our week's lessons, unbeknown to us when we booked the shearing shed. Richard Tognetti and Satu Vanska from our ACO have played music there. Ansel Kiefer and Manuela Luca Dazio have arrived by helicopter. The NGV have held a design camp here, Journeys into Contemporary Making, as well as holding 3 Tasmanian narratives gatherings, and now a new AIA symposium that will be held annually on the site. Through our Bruni making workshops held each year, our staff learn from skilled craftspeople about the cultural values embedded in the process of making. Our activities include an observation deck, a sundial that accurately tells the time between 12:15 and 1:45 for half the year, a series of fire pits, a bridge, a bathhouse, a pottery kiln, and a kayak shed span our coastal edge. I look forward to interlacing specific cultural knowledge from research being undertaken into the pre-colonial history of our special place. Our time within the pandemic may well have adjusted our focus more critically to the details of light, air, outlook, and all those assembled elements that register our sense of belonging. There are very few buildings that have engaged and sustained my interest that have been either devoid of fine detail or carelessly assembled. This characteristic of architectural composition amplifies human endeavour in a sequence of occurrences. Firstly, the invention of a small detail that may cause materials to merge or separate or be formed in a particular way is an acutely creative act that then encourages the participation of others within our practice and beyond to develop and then fabricate. These processes can also encourage technological invention to occur and many new materials to be developed over time, and particularly is it a shared experience with others that really enhances this idea of architecture placing itself at the heart of a community's values. We've always had a preoccupation with the making of things. This curiosity takes us out of the studio and into many workshops and factories to form relationships that have endured across many projects. This interest draws us backwards and forwards, back to the history of materials and making, and forward to new applications of craft and the implementation of new technologies. The bespoke and idiosyncratic was somewhat lost in the 20th century as mass industrialisation celebrated repetition, standardisation and highly processed materials. In the 21st century, we find ourselves working on digital platforms that interface directly with the digital technologies of industry, more akin to the artisans of the 19th century who at that time were infusing craft with technology. We add to this equation the craft of materials usage and the critical evaluation of the whole process of resourcing and assembly to accord with new metrics for sustainability. Within the practice, we feel that this is an exciting era as new forms of craft are evolving that link more strongly to communities' values. Manufacturing processes have influenced patterns of settlement, regional variance and generational identity of those involved in every aspect of such enterprise. Discovering things that are conceived, developed and made within one region is one of the drivers of authentic experience. A global pandemic has caused us to critically be aware of the consequences of the loss of local manufacturing. This concern with craft and fit and assembly translates to the scale of the city itself, as we frequently seek to find accordance with, and at times disrupt, the patterns that exist beyond the boundaries of our commission. In doing so, we position our work as an active agent in the evolution of such places. At times, the patterns may be lost or barely register in the jostle of a city, but we can be confident that they are reclaimed by architecture's ability to recall. For our Bendigo law courts, we've worked with the historic 180-year-old Bendigo pottery to produce, with new extrusion technology, a complex wall system that will define areas of public arrival and congregation within this new court precinct. When examining our own work and the work of many others, the invented detail of many small elements within a building can be an evocation of the entire strategy of the whole project. Whole essays can be written on the counterweighted stone gate designed by Carlo Scarpa that pronounces entry to the architectural faculty at Venice University, as well as details of merging and holding apart in Castle Vecchio that Carlo Scarpa so invested in so many details in. Leverance's great plays with surface and perforation remain primary lessons of his built work. Ath's work and his preoccupation with civic ideas, community, and his forceful, humorous expression is strongly felt through his houses. There's a shared attitude between us, using our houses as testing grounds for our larger public buildings. If ever a house could laugh, it surely must be his own. Some years ago, I spoke at a conference in Shanghai. I visited an antique market in the old town, and while looking through the many stalls, I came across a young guy who asked me whether I'd like to buy a genuine Ming bowl. I expressed interest and agreed to follow him. We walked for several blocks as the streets became smaller and turned to laneways, then passages between light courts behind buildings. We turned many times until we reached an ancient timber staircase within what appeared to be an empty building of many rickety levels. Another guy fell into line behind us and I started to feel apprehensive. Up 2 or 3 levels and 2 more joined into the procession. At this point, I began to feel concerned for my safety. Then the leader of the 4 unlocked the door to an empty room, then closed it behind us. Panic set in as I considered the likelihood of a violent encounter about to take place. Just as he opened an old cupboard and removed a small wrapped object, I decided to run. As I fled for the door, I saw him unwrap and hold to the light. From a single window, there appeared the most beautiful bowl I have ever seen. By now it was too late. Whilst admiring the bowl fleetingly, I'd already pushed one of the guys to the floor and leapt for the door and hurled myself down the stairs, descending to ground level. I shall never know its value or authenticity. I'm fairly certain the 4 weren't potters nor archaeologists, but they'd had plenty of opportunity to do me harm and didn't do so. My moment of panic remains one of my great life regrets. Small objects such as these can be considered maquettes that can be scaled up through discussion as they are infused with aesthetic value, acutely express the process of their making, and like architecture itself, contain stories that encompass utility and cultural practice. As a material, ceramics remains enduringly contemporary. My first ceramic purchase was a prop in the David Jones store. An enterprising member of their design team had travelled to Copenhagen to collect items to background a Danish fashion festival. After much persuasion, almost daily, I was able to purchase it at the end of the festival. It's a teapot, probably designed by Erik Magnusson, that exhibits social equity as it rotates to allow for many hosts and exhibits a hierarchy of glazed and unglazed elements. Some years later, I designed a coffee, or in fact a tea table, to extend its expression of sociability. Our proposal is one of 5 invited entrants for the new Australian Pavilion in Venice in 2012, advocated for a complex system of terracotta segments that were developed with industrial designer Simon Lloyd. Fired from a mix of Australian ochres and Italian soils, ridges and seams created a vigorous texture that we imagined would be made by small terracotta factories in the Veneto. The gallery's outer profile formed the outline of Palladio's Loggia del Capitano, which then formed an open side, suggesting the informal Australian marquee. The sheer complexity of the idea appeared to terrify the jury. It was apparently the first to be discarded and remains one of our most glorious failures. The system's vases were devised also with Simon Lloyd as vessels of constituent parts, in the same way that a house will contain separate spaces that accord to the various functions of living. Also, the first of a series of topography bowls is in production, each suggesting separate aspects of landscape while also providing some form of culinary utility, though I'm not sure what. A visit to the historic bottle kilns of Stoke-on-Trent later found expression in discussion with our team when we were designing the Learning and Teaching building at Monash University. These towering forms and associated gathering spaces also invite parallels between the process of firing that starts with malleable clay and the intense processes of tertiary education on the raw matter of young minds. And most recently, and in this love of this wonderful material, a new family home for my family on the western coast of Victoria, where terracotta in all its forms is the complete material of the house. So first actually designing right down to the unit of the brick itself, so a special brick being created that will express the entire external elevations of the house, and then looking carefully and deeply into the nature of the brick itself and its glazed surface. And the interior, as I've expressed this idea of hybridity, as a series of terracotta systems made by a friend of ours, the Manetti Terracotta family, the oldest terracotta company in Tuscany, just outside Florence, is making all of the terracotta materials for the interior. I should say that each time I build a family home, this is the third, I have actually brought on a global recession. So the house is halfway through construction now, and I do apologise to all of you if some of the current economic signals prove to be the case. When visiting Louis Kahn's Exeter Academy, I saw the Harkness table and learnt its story. It was developed at Exeter and named after Edwin Harkness, the American oil magnate and philanthropist who suggested its intent, an education system that proposes equity between educator and student. We meet our clients at such tables. It is interesting to see how our eye contact works and how conversations flow across a table, and how the shape of the table can give form to our engagement. I've designed a dining table for many of our residential commissions. Each table is different and conceived toward the end of the project, reflecting a deep understanding of our clients' lives. There are links through this gesture to the craft of making, to the materiality of the larger project itself, and the narrative of our engagement. The table in our Kelly's cottage combines an original 1820s gate leg table made in Hobart that had been used by a family in the cottage for many years, and a newly purchased pedestal table made in Sydney in the 1850s. They're joined by a section of new Tasmanian blackwood, with the overall impression that each object has retained its own detail and story, but combined they make for an eccentric social setting and an inconvenience of legs. Our "An Idea Needed to be Made" table was the central element in an exhibition of contemporary ceramics at Hybridity Gallery in Melbourne. Measuring 20 metres by 4, it was made from 36 discarded timber tables sourced from op shops and Gumtree. Two of our young staff went out with a maximum budget of $75 for each. Together, this strange collection was transformed by the serendipitous coming together of legs nearly touching, edges meeting, and sinuous gaps between an unlikely community of tables. In doing so, territories were created to allow the curation of variance within the ceramic community. Tables for universities, now infused with technology, encourage discourse-driven learning, in doing so referring directly to Harkness's initiative. I've always considered these tables that nearly span the entire history of the practice to be not really part of the main game, but probably now more recently do appreciate that in some ways they are footnotes to the chronology of the larger stories and the endeavour of making of many of these larger projects. In February this year, I had an exhibition, relatively useful. It was a survey of the works in timber, steel and ceramic designed by myself and my good friend Simon Lloyd. We worked with 25 local makers for this show at McLachlan and Everest's Heide Museum of Modern Art. It was interesting to develop, again, the skills of these young makers and find an opportunity to express their skills as much as our ideas in the nature of furniture, particularly that for the domestic setting. As a young graduate in 1982, I visited Teatro Olimpico in Vicenza. The theatre, designed by Palladio in 1550, houses Vincenzo Scamozzi's trompe-l'oeil street scenes that exaggerate the perspective from each of Palladio's 5 portals. Upon entering the vacant theatre, the voice of an elderly Italian man, speaking English with an American accent, commenced reciting the theatre's history. Initially unseen and then only fleetingly as he walked back and forth along and between Scamozzi's streets, he described the intentions of its great creators. He began by drawing upon the compositional techniques used for each variant perspective, highlighting how combined they achieve a performative quality within the space that distorts our perception of scale and distance. In continuing his narrative by describing an additional perception, that of aural shape, immersing himself within the surroundings, he illustrated his point, projecting his voice in a manner that supported his thesis that acoustic character is also formed within the confines of a space, lending it a perspective reading of equal value to that perceived visually, an important lesson for architects. This idea was heightened in his closing performance as he walked to the front of the stage, ready to engage with us, his audience of 2. He looked straight ahead, missing us completely. We realised that this elderly man was in fact blind, and his perception acutely aural. This story has had many lives over many projects within our studio discussions. The recalibrated internal reveals of the windows of Joseph Reed's neoclassical facade suggest the confluence of alignments within the new interior for the Melbourne School of Design at Melbourne University. And most recently referred back to me by a team member as a diagram of Teatro Olimpico was modified to become more street than stage. Students and staff become both audience and performer in a new learning and teaching building for the University of Tasmania. The view to beyond is preserved as the portal is inhabited. An appreciation of the spatial perception is a means of navigation that has informed many parts of many of our projects. The registering of our place in space and perception of the world beyond is central to human experience, and it's informed the planning of many of our buildings as we have arranged spaces sequentially to unfold frames of experience. Thresholds and portals, those moments of intimacy and engagement, of arrival and outlook, when interior and exterior space meet, are consistently the most intensive elements of our work. In October 2017, we were invited to participate in the 2018 Venice Architecture Biennale. We had developed an interest in Venice in our ill-fated Australian Pavilion competition entry, but more recently in our successful design for the inaugural Tapestry Design Prize for the Australian Tapestry Workshop in 2015. Will be further referred to our exchange between Italy and Australia. In this work, a series of sets were created to reverse Scamozzi's inverted perspectives, forming picture planes that were drawn more toward the audience. The partial views and variant transmissions of light within each of these inverted chambers suggested a place that was elsewhere. Our initial proposal to the creative directors was to build the structure imagined in our tapestry, build it as an actual object. It was to be both bridge and portal, providing a long lens from its place within the Arsenale back toward Australia. Over time, our initial ideas evolved and transformed, in part through a process of creative collaboration. Gradually, it progressed to become more instrument-like, much like a camera with its body removed, to express its working functions. A series of portals would contain mirrors devised by artist Natasha Johns Messenger and films by two young filmmakers, Coco and Maximilian. A mask combined the inner form and fit of a Venetian mask with the single broad slot that Australians recognised in the hand-wrought steel mask of our bushranger Ned Kelly, known to us through Nolan's Kelly series paintings. Visitors to the exhibition were invited to push hard against that mask to look within the vast cantilevering quilted portal toward a cinematic representation of places within buildings. Each of these 5 variant portals suggests both specific and universal experiences of being within and passing through interior space. Somewhere or other was conceived in Melbourne, meticulously constructed in Geelong, and clad in spotted gum from New South Wales, with a funneled shape form blown in Venetian glass by master craftsmen on the island of Murano, and supported on a framework of steel fabricated in a shed in rural Victoria. In Venice, we soaked the inner walls with eucalyptus to honour the lessons of that old Italian. We're working within an era where narrative is one of the primary descriptors of the creative endeavour of what we do as architects. I would separate what I would describe as the narrative of authorship to that of experience. Buildings stand for so long that it seems implausible that the stories of their author's creative objectives should remain the primary narrative for the life of the project. Sensory receptivity requires little knowledge of authorship as we navigate and then experience the places that we inhabit. Our buildings frequently contain a series of narratives, but they are told in a manner that requires engagement and discovery, and then a degree of self-interpretation. Instead of imprinting one complete story, we reveal the suggestion of a story, leaving space for interpretation. The subtleties and degrees of abstraction invite individual experience to become part of collective experience. The term open-endedness was coined that continued into a series of explorations into extrusion and cut ends, where life within the building became part of the composition of the primary elevation. At times, we appropriate other people's stories and add them to our own, fueling narratives that may or may not be evident in the completed work, and I'm not sure that matters. C.J. Dennis's ode to the Sydney Harbour Bridge when it opened, "I dips me lid," became our "I dips me lid." In our case, we dipped to a different Sydney, to the Sydney Myer Music Bowl in Melbourne's Domain, as the single sweep of an idea in our design for the NGV's ephemeral architecture program, Summer Pavilion. This reference to another Sydney pays homage to the exuberant and innovative structure of one of Melbourne's great civic spaces. The tensile structure of one century became the grid shell structure of another. This supported a massive polycarbonate ceiling that would pronounce a place for many activities over the duration of that summer. Actually, I might just grab a quick water if I could. You will take a big deep breath. Our referencing of D.H. Lawrence's quote, "upside down at the bottom of the world," informed the suspended studios in the Melbourne School of Design building at the University of Melbourne. Much of what we do in this country adapts, modifies, and in the process irrevocably changes cultural practice from elsewhere to fit the circumstances, environment and climate of our location. Working constantly in this context has provided a framework of reference that celebrates the rigour of hybridity. The 66 small Japanese tiles set into some of the 150,000 small recesses in the concrete facade of Melbourne's New Conservatorium suggest music. Is it a visual rendition of sound, or the impression of sheet music, or an interpretation of digital recording? Are the empty recesses the moments between sound that is part of composition? The many discussions with Neil Gerbach and Camilla Block that embedded from Gerbach Block Jackers embedded in the facade of Phoenix Central Park in Chippendale in Sydney. If there appears to be a high degree of abstraction here, it is evidence of such long discussions infused with humour and distracted by circumstances of such duration that the moment of conception was completely lost, even to its authors. This vast gallery space suggests two things really that make it a personal museum: intimacy, that intimacy of association with a single work, and the journey, as we imagine the curated journey by a host through and around the gallery, but also that idea of a civic ceiling that comes through in so many of our places of gathering is evident here at the end of that journey in this massive figured skylit ceiling. Escarpment became a fascination of ours when designing our Cradle Coast building for the University of Tasmania. It is now completed, a whole university in a single building. So on an edge of a disrupted landscape, on a very harsh coastal environment in a very industrial city, the first signpost for tertiary education locally is evident in this one building. But we thought it was important to reclaim the thing that is so known to people who live in that region, this idea of this ruptured, dramatic landscape on this coastal edge. So many of our houses register the theatre of family life through deep discussions with highly engaged clients. The Vineyard House arranged social and intimate spaces within the plan, within our understanding of the viticultural processes of budstock and rootstock. The Shearers' Quarters and Captain Kelly's Cottage on Bruni Island tell stories of landscape, of settlement, of industry, sea captains, graziers and orchardists, the carpentry techniques of ship's carpenters who actually had built old Captain Kelly's cottage, having never built a house before, and inflected geometries. And our Fairhaven house unpacked activities on arrival and lined all of them with separate moments within a broad coastal panorama. For the same clients recently, and on the other coast of Victoria, this house plays on the traditional narrative of the Australian farmhouse. It's in direct contrast to its predecessor that had a fascination with views. This hunkers into a big open landscape and looks completely inward. The impression that I wanted to really express was that almost cartoon-like expression of what we know as familiar with the Australian farmhouse, reduced to just its three elements of roof, walls and chimney. In doing so, it appears almost cartoon-like on the edge of this secondary sand dune. It became part of a process of storytelling, first within our office as we established almost a set of rules for designing a house. We looked at the nature of farmhouses, the repeated elements, a very efficient program, a limited number of details repeated, and the sorts of things that we find evident in the history of the Australian farmhouse. So it was to have a single concrete floor, but the concrete floor was to establish itself on the topography of the land rather than the containment of the house. As the land fell away, the concrete floor is then replaced by a timber floor in those areas where we must provide program that sits elevated above the landscape. The enclosure is constant and repeated, as are the materials and systems. The 3 types of windows only, so this idea of repeated elements. And so that it becomes something other than that it's first appreciated upon arrival. In fact, this strategy of having a continuous framework for both roof and walls, but the floor obeying this rule of establishing itself on the topography, provides probably its most dramatic moment of family assembly in this undercroft under the continuing encircling of the walls and roof. That establishes the idea of this inner frame of reference back into this vast courtyard, and the spaces all within then accord with this single loop of the rectangular form of this continued roofscape. We respond to the work of artists to help us make sense of our lives and the world around us, and also at times provide us with moments of release and joy. The ability of art to provide provocation helps us to contend with uncertainties and conflicts that are beyond our control. We appreciate their ability to interpret reality and challenge necessity. These works located in public places become shared artefacts and form part of a community's art collection. Most recently at our new building for Curtin University's School of Design and the Built Environment in Perth, Janet Lawrence provided a remarkable public artwork that has become actually the centrepiece of the entire experience of this vast academy. Here, this artwork celebrates in a very direct but still abstract sense, almost using the meticulousness we would imagine a jeweller might do of providing clasps onto precious stones. Each of these rock samples from every part of the state of Western Australia have been fixed to this massive 5-storey high concrete wall just out of reach of this central staircase. But in doing so, it becomes something that's much more likely than the architecture itself to question the minds of the students. Is it political? Does it talk about the extraction processes evident in the economy of their state, the preciousness of memories for so many Indigenous Australians that can be disrupted by that process? It has so many layers of meaning, and yet in its expression, it is a completely abstract work. In 2003, we commissioned Peter Kennedy to create an artwork that ran the length of our Russell Street studio. The neon artwork And So Illumination 1 allows us to witness the powerful connection to the city that can be created by the involvement of an artist. This work has been recognised by many people and deeply appreciated. So when we moved to away from this office and to a new office studio in the gritty part of industrial Collingwood, Peter came back with us and recalibrated it to wrap around 2 street corners to pronounce our arrival in our Rokeby Street studio. And now establishing a Sydney studio, a further part of it has now been set on the curtain wall of that building. On top of the world is a series of studio roof terrace events where people from across the visual arts are invited to speak. Each guest speaker designs a flag which is raised at the start of the event. The evenings are a way of bringing together clients, collaborators and friends of the practice to take a moment to appreciate the different perspectives in art through the medium of a single flag. Art practice is often a focus for broad-ranging activities within our practice. At the midpoint of deepest, darkest lockdown, we assumed roles within our favourite paintings. Just as art doesn't require a script to be appreciated, do we need one to understand a building? And can our appreciation be both universal and specific to place and culture? We do know that we're imprinted genetically and cellularly from generations past. The imprinting of pain and joy and habit comes from hundreds of years of pain and joy and habit, which suggests that our specific cultural awareness may determine much of our memories of appreciation. I imagine that aesthetic appreciation is instinctive and relies on memory and the brain's recall of experience from all of our senses. This may suggest that buildings can only speak to an audience in a single language. However, as we counter intellect with emotion, we are so often drawn to collective, ineffable appreciation of aesthetic experience and an instinctive acuity that encompasses the span of time, the geography of the planet, and its many cultures. Thank you.